Good afternoon. My paper was on the crisis of divorce, and I chose this because, of course, it's a very well known crisis in our society. This crisis of divorce. Excuse me, there's a fly in my room here. Um, but even more importantly, maybe for me, it's a very personal issue because I'm a child of divorce, and so I think I've personally felt the effects of this crisis. Divorce is one of the most prevalent topics in crisis in our culture, and one of the reasons that it's such a crisis is because it's so accepted and so normal. And what's interesting in a culture that does seem to value that, let me put it this way, a culture that wants to make sure kids seem to be healthy and happy, we tend to ignore the effect that divorce has on a child. This idea of divorce through media and culture and TV and all these things has been normalized to such a degree where it's almost celebrated. This idea of finding your true self, finding your happiness, all these things. And what's interesting about this is that almost all, even secular therapists and counselors and psychologists would agree that divorce has extremely harmful effects on children. Gary Collins states in his book, Christian Counseling, the research confirmed that even though most children divorced grow into successful and stable adults, the majority report they were affected adversely by the parental divorce. What you see is like these two things that butt up against each other, which is the happiness and well being of a child and the wishes and sometimes the whims of a married adult. They come at each other and they're in tension because what's best we see with every stat you can find, what's best is a two-parent household of mother and father for the children, and you have parents. And now, granted, there are many times there's reasons for divorce. There's also many times where reconciliation is possible but not taken. God's design for marriage, and all these cases we see every day, prove that a lifelong commitment to marriage and family, it's the bedrock for a healthy society. When that breaks down, everything breaks down. And who gets affected really is the most vulnerable, which is our children. And that's the focus of my paper and of this talk today. The effects of divorce on children can be hard to quantify, but there's no doubt or debate that it leaves a lasting scar. We see through studies almost always a sense of anger, a lot of loss, abandonment, fear about the future, tend to blame oneself, accompanied by guilt, resentment at parents, delays in maturity. In addition, there's academic and relational problems that many times can go on for decades in the child of divorce. We even see reports in here of a regression in some kids to more childish behavior, such as bedwetting or return to thumb sucking, or various forms of acting out in rebellions. So John Hopkins research says this: many adults with very successful lives still carry a residual trauma in their everyday life due to their parents' breakup. Two large studies, one in 1991 and one 10 years later in 2001, showed that children with divorced parents continue to score significantly lower on measures of academic achievement, conduct, psychological adjustment, self-concept, and social relations. And not only are children's emotional and long-term prospects deeply affected, so are their financial resources of the family. Hear this: custodial mothers experience a loss of 25 to 50% of their pre-divorce income. Unmarried women are more likely to remain in poverty compared with married individuals and unmarried men. The loss of financial security has devastating effects on a child's life and well-being. However, the negative effects of divorce don't end there. Divorce also changes and sometimes permanently destroys the relationship between a parent and a child. Most instances, the mother receives custody of the child and because of her divorce and financial strain, they don't have the emotional capacity to care for a child the way a child might need. And so this leads to a breaking in the bond between a mother and a child because the mother is so consumed with grief and hurt and trying to work more jobs, all these things, it leads to a break in their relationship. But also we see even worse are the results for a father and a child. A study in 1996 found that fewer than half of children living with a divorced mother had seen their fathers at all in more than 1 year. Only 1 in 6 saw their fathers once a week. So what you're going here is you move from divorce to neglect. As I studied this, one of the most damaging ways that divorce affects children long term is how it negatively affects their schoolwork. In one study, the way divorce affects relationships long term, so they are far more likely to have a negative life satisfaction and a view on peers. It shows they are more likely to deal with anxiety throughout their life and schoolwork. All these add up to a multitude of really hard things that adversely affect children. But think about this and how this is really a crisis. It's the ripple effect. Because when you have a culture that in a sense promotes happiness at all costs and promotes this idea of divorce, and we see through study after study that the ones most affected are children. And this leads a multitude, a generation of children who are adversely affected emotionally, academically, financially, and with their parental bonds. And what we see here is this legacy of trauma, of hurt, and dysfunction that ripples down all throughout society. And you can see it today in a culture of directionless young people that are not sure where to turn because they've lost some of those essential things that a child needs. So the question for Christian counselors and ministers is this: how do we provide appropriate care in the midst of this crisis? So the first step that a counselor, ministers can take is to identify the severity of the problem and the consequence of the child's and parents' divorce. When divorce takes place in a marriage that includes children, it should be viewed as an emergency type situation that requires dispatch, intelligence, compassion, and helping to structure an existence for the children that protects their integrity and their emotional well-being. The other next step for Christian ministers and counselors is then to move towards the parents and to prepare the parent for how to best care for the child during this time. Because while a counselor can help, and it's so important, a counselor's there maybe an hour a week or an hour a month with the child, but the parent is going to be the primary person to help them walk through this crisis. So one of the best things that counselors can do is give divorced parents, tools on how to do this. And then a counselor is free then to help a child learn how to grieve, how to cope, and all the stuff that takes. And this process of grieving we see here can take 2 to 5 years. It has 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And on a spiritual lens, this child or any person walking through divorce or difficulty, it's helpful and right to remind them of what's true. And we find what's true in Romans 8, verse 28. That even in the midst of hard things, God works all things together for the good of those who love them. So as a counselor, we listen, we empathize, we sit in the pain with the child, with the parents of divorce. But then we remind them of what is true, of what is that healing is possible, that God is near, that God does love them, and God will be with them in the midst of their trauma, of their pain, of this crisis, and of their hurt. And that change is possible. And that God can walk through them and be with them and help heal them. This is a great topic to study. Hope it's encouraging for you guys. Thanks.